Story 1. A car accident. When I was 10 years old, my stepdad and I were out visiting his cousin, who lived in a rural area in southern Oregon. We had stayed out late and the sun had gone down about 2 hours before we called it a night and started to head home, about 40 minutes away. We were driving through a lightly wooded area with several ranches spread along the route, but for the most part the road was empty and pitch black outside of our headlights. As we cruised along the winding back road, a car suddenly came up behind us at excessive speed. Without missing a beat, the guy swerved around us and flew on down the road, soon out of sight around the next turn in the road. "Jerk," my dad muttered. I had been half asleep, but I agreed with my dad and leaned my head back against the window. We drove on for about another half mile when we saw the guy again. My dad pulled to a stop as we came onto the scene. The man had taken a turn too sharply and run through a mailbox, through a fence and into a tree. The car was smashed, the front end crushed in from the impact, glass everywhere, and steam from the radiator poured into the cold night air. The guy stood next to his car staring at it. My dad told me to stay there and got out. I could see him walk over to the guy and say something. The guy pointed at his car, then spoke to my dad. After a minute they walked back to our car and my dad got into the driver's seat. The guy got into the back as I was in the front seat. I glanced back at the man's car and all the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I sat stiffly in my seat as my dad started our car and began driving. "We're gonna give this guy a ride home," my dad explained. "'Kay," I replied. The guy spoke. "Hey, I really appreciate this. I guess I judged that turn wrong. My wife is gonna be pissed. Just glad I made it out okay." "Yeah," my dad replied. The man made small talk with my dad and tried to talk to me a couple times, asking where we lived, where I went to school, if I liked my teacher, that kind of thing. I only answered him with one-word answers, refusing to look over my shoulder or in the rear-view mirror at him. After a few miles he said, "This is it," and we pulled over. He got out and walked around to my dad's side of the car. "Hey, thanks, I really appreciate this." He held his hand out and my dad shook it, then we started back home. After about 10 minutes I turned to my dad. "Dad. That guy." "I know," he said. "But Dad." I saw into his car. He was still in there. He looked at me with a very serious look that I'd never seen before or since. "I know. We've never spoken about it since then, and I've never told anyone else." Story 2. Don't get out of your car late at night, no matter what tries to stop you. When I was a 17-year-old moody teenager, I had a big argument with my mom one night about how she just didn't understand my needs and stormed out of the house. I was going to go for a walk, but it was freezing outside and really dark, so I did a quick walk of shame past my mom and grabbed my car keys, giving her a quick explanation of going on a Mac Cass run before storming out yet again, giving the door a nice slam on my way. I jumped in my terribly old and crappy bright red Suzuki Swift and cranked the heat, which made the engine scream in protest. I turned my angry teen music up and pulled out onto the dark streets. I drove to McDonald's in about 10 minutes and decided I was too mad to eat, and to calm down I would go on a nice drive. Just down the road another 15 minutes was a stretch of pitch black windy road that had lots of hairpin corners as it ran down a massive gorge to a small lake with a single lane bridge going across it. If that doesn't sound scary enough, the road was called the Galston Gorge. Fun facts, and you can Google this road, it's in Sydney, Australia. James Gibson's camera was found on this road. He was one of Ivan Milat's victims. The dude Wolf Creek was inspired by and one of Australia's worst serial killers, so it has a pretty creepy background and therefore is completely deserted at night. As I was making my way down the gorge, which is a road I know very well as I learned to drive on it with my mom, she took me a lot at night to learn night driving on a difficult road. I turned a hairpin corner and as my headlights swung around it lit up the road ahead and I saw a black medium-shaped object in the middle of the road. It made me jump, but I assumed it was just a dead kangaroo. As I continued ahead, the closer I got to this object, I realized as I was almost on top of it that it was a baby car seat with the front covered in a blanket. I hit my brakes and my car screamed in protest even louder. I sat in my seat staring at this baby seat, clenching my steering wheel. No way I was getting out when it was probably just a broken and dumped booster seat. I was about to pull off when I heard a noise. I turned my music down, but the sound of my shitty car engine made it hard to locate or recognize the noise. I wound my window down an inch and listened. It was a fucking baby crying. No, crying is an understatement. This poor thing was screaming. I threw my seatbelt off and unlocked my door, grabbing the handle, then I froze. Out of the corner of my eye in the bush I thought I saw something move. It was just out of reach of the light from my headlights. I took my hand off the door slowly and sat back into my seat thinking. I remember my mom telling me to never stop my car at night, that if I see something that requires help then to move on and call for professional help, because there's nothing that requires the help of a moody short little blonde girl who can barely carry her school bag. A baby needs my help, a tiny defenseless baby. What if that was a wild animal I saw in the trees coming to have a meal out of this little thing, I thought before I opened my car door. As I did, my car let out a screech, causing whatever it was in the trees to jump. I slammed my door closed, jumping back in, and sped up the road. I got a few hairpins back up the gorge before pulling out my phone. Still no signal as I'm driving in a literal hole. I raced up to the top and back into busy streets, then called for police. I told them what I saw and they told me to go home immediately, not to stop whatsoever, keep my doors locked, and they would call me tomorrow, but not to worry. The next morning Hornsby police called me thanking me for my report. They said a group of men have been placing baby seats in the middle of empty roads, covering them with a blanket which hides a speaker playing the sounds of children in distress to try and lure young women out of their cars. They then drag these women away and take advantage of them and beat them, then driving away in the women's car, leaving their victim to die in the bushes. They checked out the gorge, but the people had left. They left in such a rush they forgot the blue baby blanket with little gray elephants on it that I had described to the police as the one covering the baby seat. They said I was clever to keep going and to never get out of my car late at night, no matter what tries to stop me. Edit. My partner and I might go for a drive along this road some night this week so I can take some photos of the place so you can get a visual idea of how creepy it is. I'll make sure the doors are locked. Story 3. I bought a brand new car. The price was too good to be true. Ding. Ding, ding. I had just opened the door to my brand new car. Well, it was new to me. The guy who sold me the car called it practically new. It had less than 3,500 miles on it, and came with all the bells and whistles. Heated seats, front and back. Cooled seats too. A navigation system, a heads-up display, lane assist, surround cameras with a nighttime driving assistant, 19-inch rims, a gorgeous red interior and glossy white paint on the outside. The ad had the price well below market value and the guy seemed eager to sell it. He was mid-30s, had ashen brown hair, a nervous pair of eyes, and kept scratching at his neck. If there was a word I'd describe him as, it would be nocturnal. My dad said crackhead though. It was the middle of the day and the sun beat a tan into my shoulders when we arrived. Even though the price was so low. And I really wanted the car. My dad told me to take another 15% off the initial offer. I was hesitant, but listened. The guy didn't even fight us. Do you have the money on you right now? I showed him the Benjamins. After our transaction my dad looked at me and beamed. Shit, we could have probably gotten an extra grand or two less than what we offered. He shook his head while circling the vehicle. I'll never understand why some people buy brand new cars and sell them a few months later. His hands outstretched, displaying the hood. Would you look at this thing, kiddo? Asterisk. I've always had an older car up until now. Cloth seats, hand-rolled windows, and an engine that worked on prayer. Which made it weird when I began worrying about my car. Having previously letting Nature's Car Wash clean my vehicle, I found myself doing it by hand on Saturdays. I even used an easy nano-wax to preserve the paint. And always going the extra mile to park it far away from other cars as possible. It was on one such night that I had parked really far away, and was walking alone back to the lot, in the dark, that I began to question my life choices. Why can't you just be normal? Park like a normal person does. Why'd you have to park the car as if you were hiding it? Dummy. A lamp post glowed in the dark, illuminating the many empty spots. There weren't so much as another car or person in sight. The lot was flat, so if there were someone hiding in the dark, at least I could see them coming. I don't know if that last thought made me feel any better, as I have never been a fast runner in my life. As I started evaluating my footwear in case of an emergency, I looked up to see my car come into view. I nearly tripped as I noticed it. I had deliberately parked so very far away so that no one else would possibly think about parking next to me. Lo and behold, the only other car in the entire lot was parked directly next to mine. Not only that, the person who had parked it was shimmied right next to my driver's side. I peered down the waist-thin space between the two vehicles and realized that my door couldn't even open. I looked down and saw the other vehicle's tire cross the parking line by nearly a foot, of course. I walked over to the passenger side and opened the door, throwing my purse, my backpack, and the stack of books into the back. Then I clambered inside, crab walking over the center console before collapsing into the driver's seat. I started the car and immediately the sensors beeped into my ear. I looked at the console and saw all the arrows blaring a deep red to my left. I winced as I slowly started backed out, making sure my mirror wouldn't hit the other car. I hear another beep and see a wispy white figure appear on my screen. I nearly screamed as I slammed on the brakes and turned around. Some guy wearing shorts and a graphic tee strode behind me. He shot me a look as he got into the car next to mine. He started it up and music blared into the night. With a quick clunk, no look back, he shifted into reverse, blocking my path, and then drove off. I looked at my center console, glad to see it clear of any warnings as I backed out and left the parking lot. I hadn't been driving for more than a few miles when the console beeped another warning. I glanced over and saw a wisp of red emerge in front of me. I looked ahead and saw steam rising out of a manhole. The light ahead of me skipped yellow and turned red. I brought the car to a stop. The entire street was empty, typical of the business side of town after dark. Come on. Where are all the traffic sensors when you need it? I wait for a few minutes, but the light didn't change. Why me? I flicked on my blinker and made a right turn. I've never gone down this way, but figured that if I made 2 more lefts and then another right, I'd be back on track. I was driving down this lonely stretch of road when my nighttime driving assistant warned me of heat signatures coming from between 2 buildings. I rubbernecked to the right to peer down the alley as I passed. Beep beep beep. The alarm came from in front. I looked up just in time to slam on my brakes. I watched as a large plastic ball tottered through the walking lane. A young boy chasing after it. His parents behind them pushing a pram as my tires squealed to a halt. I looked up, afraid to meet their eyes, but eventually waving a guilty hand at them in apology. They didn't even look at me. Just walked silently past. It was weird seeing a family out at this hour, near this part of town. Even more odd were their clothing. The man was in a full 3-piece suit and the woman had on a long frilly dress that was covered in soft pink. I was about to crane my neck to see where they were headed, but the light above me turned green and so I made a left turn. I was greeted by a long stretch of road that I had never seen before and a tall brick wall with a wrought iron gate that lined my right side. I couldn't see past the bricks as the lawn that sat above it had created a dense fog. This street was also long and empty. It was so long that I couldn't see the next stoplight in front of me. I kept driving, the spooling of my turbo hissing into the night with each prompt shift. I reached my hand forward to turn on some music so that I wouldn't feel so alone, but I needn't have bothered. On my screen I see 3 white dots emerge up ahead. I glance up at the road, my hand dead in the air as it stopped short of the knob. I couldn't see anyone. I really hoped they weren't trying to cross the street. I adjusted my glasses and reached for the radio again. I looked down and noticed that more white dots had appeared on my screen. Again I look up and see no one ahead. I really hope this thing wasn't broken. Maybe that is why the guy had sold it to me. The car was a lemon. Before I could worry about the financial impact of it all, I looked at the center console and noticed that a horde of white dots had formed in front of me. Instinctively my foot edged over to the brake as I looked up. Nothing. Not a single living person in front of me. Maybe it's the fog. I looked to my right. Maybe it's broken. I looked at the console. I really hope it's not broken. This time I reached for the radio knob, pressing it down firmly. This is KCR1 coming at you with, playing this next, Kep Cree Dash. The radio cut off, and the lights around the console dimmed. I looked at the wheel and peered through the small window between the spokes at my dashboard. All of the check lights were lit up. I pressed my foot back on the gas, but the car began to slow down. I looked at my shifter and a prominent orange D indicated that I was still in gear. I hear the engine churning, clunking, as it grinds to a halt. Oh God, what did I do? I looked around the cabin searching for clues. What I was looking for, I had no idea. I depleted the brake and pushed the shifter back into park. I then tried to restart the car. The engine sputtered and my headlights blinked. The hood on the engine shook as it tried to come alive. No. I tried the button again. Nothing. I slammed my palms into the steering wheel and recoiled slightly as they stung. Okay, I breathed, this is why we have insurance. I'll just give them a call and dash. Beep. 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 Beep 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 beep. I looked up and noticed that parts of the fog had rolled over the raised brick to my right and spilled out onto the sidewalk. Not a person in sight, but a look at my console showed a litter of white dots forming on the screen. Beep. 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 The sounds of the alarm bleeding into my ear as I swiveled my head in panic. A glance down showed that the white dots had gotten closer. The first few beginning to turn into white wisps as they were close enough to image. My eyes were glued to the screen as I watched one of the wisps growing. It was long and gangly, its arms near its knees as it walked closer, 8 feet, 7, 6. I looked up and saw nothing but the long dark street ahead. I pressed down on my horn, the thing honked like a choked goose struggling to breathe. I could see my eyes widening in the rearview mirror as panic rose into my throat. I punched the horn again to hear it squeal. And to my horror, more white dots appeared on the screen as if I was drawing them in. I tried to start the car again, but to no avail. I reached into the back with my eyes still glued to the windshield, my hands searching desperately for my bag as the sensors kept beeping. The green arrows in front of me started blinking yellow. I hit the console with my free hand and I must have pressed something because my heads-up display glowed in the night, showing the lane in front of me in crisp colored lines. The white dots gathered on my windshield kept getting closer. I screamed as the arrows bled red and a thump came onto the front of my hood. I looked at the console and saw a trail of white light and the big bold lettering, "Warning, warning, warning" on the display. I pried open the door handle and ran out of the car. I kept running as I headed down the street, lights began to come into view. I screamed when I saw someone walking. They looked at me startled as I lunged after them. The girl nearly fell as she turned and began to run away. I looked behind me, afraid that something had followed me. But there was nothing there. I realized it must have been me. Running toward her, screaming my head off in the middle of the night. So I slowed down and tried to catch my breath as I approached the next person. My car stopped running. "Please. I need to use your phone," I blurted out. Asterisk. By the time a towing truck had arrived, dawn was breaking in the horizon. As we were headed toward my car I could see the brick walls coming into view, stretches of green grass behind it. I had been expecting a cemetery but was surprised to see a golf course. I could see white golf balls flying in the air and little white carts patrolling the perimeter. When we stopped in front of my car, I looked across the way and saw that I was directly adjacent to the course's driving range. A dozen balls were arching in the sky toward us, some landing a few feet short of the property line. I shook my head and almost laughed. I finally did laugh when the car roared alive behind me as the tow truck driver had given it a test before putting it onto the back of the bed. He shook his head. "Works just fine." He handed me back the keys and left. I got back inside my vehicle and was happy to see that there were no more warning lights. And now I could see the little white dots lining the console. I looked up and saw a loose golf ball or two as well in the sky. Satisfied, I began driving home. I pulled onto my street and opened my garage door, pulling into my house. I hear the familiar beep of the front bumper as I get into my parking spot, and smile at myself for being overtly dramatic. My giggling turned into a gut-wrenching laugh as I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel. I had finally caught my breath, the sides of my mouth hurting from smiling when I looked up at the center console. It was still beeping. The arrows in front of me had nearly stopped, but a single white dot had appeared from behind me. I looked into the rearview mirror and saw nothing but the slant in my driveway. I looked down at the console again. The dot had grown into a wisp. Beep. Beep beep beep. Story 4. My husband hasn't been the same since the car accident. We were lucky to survive. That was what I believed. When I woke in the hospital bed, I dismissed my broken wrist and the pulsating pain in my stitched brow. I was simply relieved that James was sitting by my bedside, holding my hand. His face bore a few cuts and bruises, but he was alive. And the wounds were shallow. Barely scrapes. My husband looked well. Far better than I looked. Lillian, he smiled. You're awake. I sobbed, clutching his hand tightly. Do you remember what happened? My husband asked. I gulped. We were driving home. There was a bridge. You swerved because... I don't know. We crashed. James nodded solemnly, though his demeanor felt strange to me. I'm so sorry, Lillian. I took my eyes off the road, and... Are you okay? I interrupted. Did something else happen? James tilted his head in an odd manner. What do you mean? I frowned. You keep calling me Lillian. That's your name, isn't it? He replied in an emotionless tone. You never call me anything but Lil, I said, raising an eyebrow. So, why are you being weird? James paused, as if cogs were whirring in his brain. Well, I was just thinking. Thinking? I asked. He nodded. Thinking about why we crashed. I gulped. I remember that there was something in the road. James' mouth twitched. They never found anything. No animal or body. I suddenly felt very foolish. I'm sorry, darling. I didn't mean to. Of course you're not yourself. This must have been traumatic for you. And that was all the excuse my husband needed. He didn't get any better. The first truly strange experience took place a week or so later, after I was released from the hospital and returned home. I stirred in the middle of the night, neck hairs pricking my pillow. Like those alert strands, I rose to attention, and my eyelids flew apart. I didn't know why, at first, but then I felt it. A thick cloud of breath, reeking of festering sewage, that weighed against my flesh. It didn't smell like the man I loved, but when I rolled over, James was certainly the one breathing heavily. My husband lay on his back, stiff as a board, but his eyes were facing me. Eyes wide open. Honey? I asked timidly. James didn't reply. He was locked onto me, seemingly unable to blink, and then he suddenly held his breath. Caught himself mid-exhale and twisted his head to face the ceiling above. His eyes didn't close. And his breathing didn't resume. We lay there for an hour. Not a sound came from my husband. At the time, I didn't believe that he'd truly been holding his breath for an hour. I told myself that it had all been a dream. Or sleep deprivation had muddled my brain. Take your pick, Lillian. Either way, you've lost it, I fearfully and unconvincingly told myself. I must have eventually fallen asleep because I woke with a fuzzy brain and an empty bed. I planned to ask James what was wrong when he got home, but I didn't. I didn't have the stomach for it. Something was different about my husband, and it wasn't trauma. No, it was something more than that. I feared him, and I didn't even have a good reason for doing so. But I would. When I first saw it, my brain did nothing with the information. I was getting ready for work. Running on autopilot. Very little is processed by my morning brain. It was whilst I tucked into my sandwich at lunch that a thought violently burst into my brain. What the fuck was next to the sink? I remembered that I'd been grimacing whilst brushing my teeth. James isn't the most hygienic man in the world, so it's not unusual for me to turn my nose up at the mess and muck he leaves in his wake. However, I hadn't recoiled at the sight of facial hair or spilled toothpaste. The filth had been a small, mushy smear of red and brown. Something that I was struggling to place, even whilst recalling it with a clear head. I'd been too tired to clean it up. Too distracted by thoughts of ongoing work projects and upcoming meetings. Upon finally slamming the brakes and deactivating unconscious mode, I processed everything. The disgust of whatever I'd seen. But an idea came to me. It sparked a euphoric rush that quickly replaced the fear, the sensation of solving a niggling mystery. It was a squashed bug. I whispered, chuckling as I realized that I'd spoken aloud and drawn attention from confused coworkers. How silly of me, I thought. Why on earth was I anxious? Was I honestly flustered about James squishing an insect? Come on, Lillian. You've done that 1,000 times. You'll clean it up later. Or ask him to do it. But it's no big deal. Relax. I tried to stop berating myself. It was my first day back at work, after all, and I was still recovering from a severe car accident. I shouldn't have diminished the struggle of recovering from the emotional and physical strain that came with the crash. It had bludgeoned my overall well-being. Yes, I'd survived. Yes, I'd physically healed. But a near brush with death will psychologically derail even the most stable and well-adjusted person. It might even make one believe that something has happened to her husband, I thought, sighing. I felt so foolish. So dramatic, as always, for letting emotions rule me. James had been so patient, in spite of my mistrust, and I felt incredibly guilty for doubting him. So, I thought about what I could do to make amends. A Thai takeaway and Donnie Darko. His favorite food, and his favorite film. The perfect solution. That would mend the recent rift in our relationship. I was certain of it. The rest of the workday raced by as I eagerly anticipated the romantic evening I was planning in my head. An evening that would put the unpleasantness of the previous week behind us. I dropped James a text telling him that dinner was going to blow his socks off. I'm hungry. That was his slightly blunt response. A little peculiar, and verging on rude, depending on how a person interprets it, but I chose to interpret it positively. On my drive home, I almost ran a red light in excitement. I find talk of love languages a little cringeworthy, but I suppose, if I were to slap a label on myself, I'd be a gift giver. That's how I show my feelings. I was eager to make everything better. There was no doubt in my mind that I'd driven James to behave strangely by behaving strangely myself. I hadn't displayed love or affection in the ways I usually did. You're such a tool, I thought as I pulled onto the driveway. I dialed the number for the local takeaway whilst I walked up the front path, and the order was placed before I'd even slipped off my black loafers. I scurried around the lounge, making the room look warm, inviting, and romantic. Then I waited for James and the delivery driver. Both should have arrived within half an hour of me arriving home. After an hour without any sign of either, I started to worry and called James. He didn't answer. "Are you okay, honey?" I asked, leaving a worried voicemail. I know I've been a little off this week, but it's been... well, you know that it's been strange. And I want to make up for that. Please. Look, I don't want to spoil anything, but I've got a lovely surprise for you here, so if you... Knocking interrupted me. Sorry, the takeaway's finally here. That was a ridiculously long wait. I thought you'd be here by now, but don't worry. I'll heat up the food when you get home. I just hope you've not been held up at work. Love you, I sighed, hanging up. I answered the door to Mike, the usual acne-ridden teenager who did the deliveries for the Thai place. He was the kid of a neighbor at the end of the road. We'd known him for years. And I could see that something was different about him. It was a primal sensation. A feeling beyond fear. It was a warning from my brain. A warning that my eyes were unable to comprehend what they were seeing. My body was unable to comprehend what it was feeling. There was nothing natural about Mike. And that only became clearer once he smiled with outstretched hands. Hands which trembled with fear or exhilaration. I didn't know which one, and I wasn't sure which would be worse. "Got your food?" he whispered. I smiled uncomfortably. "Yes, I see that, Mike. Thank you. Give my best to your mother, won't you?" I saw something which I wish I could erase from my mind. Something I wish I could erase from reality. A shape swam out of his mouth. It was not a tongue running between chapped, crusty lips. It was a small, slithery, brown thing. A living thing, followed by an identical companion. A frightened sound unwillingly emerged from the pit of my body, and I quickly clasped one hand to my mouth whilst hurriedly using the other to snatch the plastic bag from the boy. It was too late. I'd already reacted. The look in my eyes. The hand on my lips. I didn't exactly hide my fear. And there'd been no point in silencing myself. He'd already heard my reaction. Seen that I'd seen. Not that I had any way of knowing what I'd seen. I wish I still had that privilege. The teenager responded to my sound of horror with a slight giggle. A giggle that grew as I slowly began to shut the door. I was too afraid to slam it in a swift motion, in case the boy on my doorstep were to react dangerously. He haunted me. And in the sliver of the ajar door, moments before I closed it, I saw something else. Wriggling shapes. Red worms, like the ones I'd seen on the boy's lips, began to burst through the blemishes on his face. They slipped through petrifying pimples that weren't really pimples at all. Just as that thing wasn't Mike at all. I finally closed the door and locked it, whilst my heart thumped without rhythm. I could hear the boy breathing on the other side of the door, and my body shook. I thought about calling the police. Thought about screaming at him to go away. He didn't want the delivery, Mike tittered erratically. Footsteps padded away, and I tried to process what the boy had said. It made no sense. The haunting pieces of the puzzle were there, but nothing meant anything. Not until James spoke. "Didn't you hear me, sweetie?" My husband cooed. The unexpected voice struck my heart with a thunderous bolt of fear, and I spun around to see James standing in the doorway to the living room. His face was clumsily painted with a smile that looked poorly learnt, as if he had never seen true joy. Never seen a true person. It was a terrifying performance from a thing that had walked among humans for a week. I knew then what I'd suspected for days. This was not my husband. "Here, what?" I whimpered, stalling for time as I fumbled with the door handle behind me. "Hear me come home, Lillian," he chuckled. "I told the delivery boy we wouldn't be needing the food. I see you've collected it anyway. That's fine. I know how it feels to be hungry. Listen, sweetie, His hand shot to the light switch, and the lobby was plunged into darkness. I yelped in fright, dropping the bag to the floor, and James' heavy shoes clomped across the tiles towards me. I screamed as fingers gripped my shoulders, and the thing with my husband's face tossed me to the ground like a limp doll. He climbed on top of me, suffocating me beneath his inexplicable weight. I saw very little in the darkness, but I felt that awful breath on my pupils, a moldy, earthy aroma that slithered under my eyelids. Staleness looking for somewhere cozy to hibernate. That was how I chose to understand it as I squinted at James' eyes in the blackness. Eyes which spilled a torrent of dark liquid. A squirming liquid, breaking into solid parts. Ravenous creatures were tumbling out of every discernible orifice, and I knew that these things had claimed James' body as a home. His mind too. I wondered whether, inside his body, there might be nothing left but those dreadful creatures. No bones or organs. Simply worms. Creatures that had filled the delivery boy in the same way. Creatures that were on the verge of taking me. "No!" I screamed. My hand wrapped around the base of the nearby coat stand, and I yanked. It toppled onto James' head. He flew backwards, disappearing into the darkness, and I immediately leapt to my feet, shrieking as I felt something slip from my cheek, something that had been all too close to entering one of my nostrils. I opened the front door, and everything came flooding back to me. As I ran into the street, I was haunted by a memory of the seconds that preceded the car accident. James had swerved into the barrier of the bridge. Swerved to avoid not a person, nor an animal, but a mass of united creatures. A traveling mass of worm-like horrors. Story 5. There's a car in my junkyard, and it's not quite right. I own a scrapyard. Have for a while. I live in a small town quite a ways away from any large cities, and as such, there aren't many people who are employed at this yard. It's just me during weekdays and Saturday, and a security guard who watches over it at night when I'm not there. The primary scrap we take in is vehicles. Mostly people's beaters and failed project cars, occasionally old farm equipment, and sometimes a school bus or two. We provide a small cash sum to the owner, and I'll get to work on taking the cars apart and salvaging whatever still works to sell as used parts. It's a job that pays okay, but I love working on vehicles, and it's rewarding to work for yourself. But I must admit, I've had a few head scratchers in my time working here. I originally didn't want to tell anyone about what I found a week ago. I truly just wanted to forget about it. At the same time, my curiosity is too strong. I need to know if anyone else has ever come across something like this. I went into work one morning, and I began to take inventory on the vehicles we had in our lot. I do this occasionally to make sure nobody vandalized anything or tried salvaging their own parts, and for the most part everything was as I had left it the night before. Everything, save for this car tucked away in the corner behind our scrap metal shed. The night before, there were exactly 6 vehicles in my lot. In the morning, there were 7. The security guard on night shift isn't supposed to allow anyone to deliver a vehicle. He doesn't know how to register it in our system, and he certainly doesn't have access to the cash safe. Was it possible that they let the deliverer drive their vehicle in to negotiate prices with me in the morning? Well, maybe, but there were no notes left on my desk about the car. There was no contact information, or even an acknowledgement about the vehicle. And it didn't stop there. The car was tucked behind the scrap shed, which seems like a very odd place to leave it if it was supposed to be seen by me. Further, and I'll admit this was when things started getting a little weird, there were no tire tracks to the vehicle. The only thing that would explain how it got there was a small hole in the side of the fence, a hole that wasn't there last night. Yet, the hole was small, not even a person could fit through it. Well, I didn't really think much of it. It was strange, but work was work, and if I was given the opportunity to salvage a car for free, I'd see no reason not to take the profit. If the vehicle owner showed up later, then great. I'd willingly strike a deal. Only, as the day went by, nobody stopped by. So by around 4, I assumed the vehicle was abandoned, hopped in my truck, and towed it to the center of the lot. Now, it's probably worth mentioning what the car looked like, because, well, once I got it where I wanted it, I took a look to see what I was working with. Right off the bat, the car looked at first glance like an old 1970s Ford Mustang, but there were no insignias on the grille. Further, it looked too long to be a Mustang, and the proportions were just wrong. I'm a bit shorter than the average man, but when I peeked inside the cabin, it was incredibly cramped, and I knew that even I would struggle to fit in it. The floor was raised far too much off the ground. Then, there were the tires. Each tire was a different size and different brand. And the axles were misaligned, but in a way that the balance of the car was not impacted. To make matters worse, the actual frame of the car was off. It was painted a dark purple, but the paint almost seemed to blend into a maroon the further back it went. And, honestly, quite the weirdest part was that the roof of the car had mold growing on it. Not the ceiling. The metal roof. There were blemishes and scratches on the car, but none of it looked as it should if the car was painted the color it was. There were parts on the chasing that were rusting, but it wasn't turning red from oxidation. It was turning black. Then, when I went to the back, the tail lights were not the same either. One was larger than the other, and the one on the right was circular, whereas the one on the left was rectangular. The headlights were weird too. There were 2 sets of headlights on the left side, and 1 set on the right. So while looking at its exterior, I decided that what I was most likely working with was a failed project car that was abandoned and perhaps the owner dropped it off at night out of embarrassment. Still, the chase thing was all wrong. I don't know where one could get a car so out of proportion like this. Further, while the overall craftsmanship was high quality, everything fit together and overall the vehicle looked structurally sound, there were just too much weirdness to be explained as the passion project of one person, unless it was their intent to make something different. But everything I told you wasn't even the worst of it. No, the worst of it was that the car smelled horribly. It smelled like rotting flesh. Which began to produce a new theory in my mind. This weird car might have been used as a dumping object for a body. The trunk was locked, so I decided to see if I could locate the keys. I opened the driver's side door, which was unsurprisingly unlocked, and saw that the keys were in the ignition. I ducked into the cramped driver's side of the vehicle, arching my back as I tried to sit in it comfortably. The moment I made contact with the driver's seat, I winced. I sunk into the fabric. The driver's seat was made of something far softer than I expected, and it was wet. I don't mean like water was spilled or the rain got in. No, the driver's seat was moist in a disgusting, uncomfortable, sticky kind of way. It felt like I was sitting on a tongue. The steering wheel was also immobile. At this point I was starting to get weirded out. However, I was already inside this weird vehicle and I wanted to know if the damn thing at least started. I put my hand on the key and turned it. At first there was nothing. Then, I could hear a sound coming from the front of the vehicle. It sounded like something thumping. Something rhythmic. There was air coming out of the AC vents, but it too was rhythmic and cold. And moist. Weirdest yet, the radio turned on. The music coming from it sounded unlike any radio station I've ever listened to. It was playing some sort of music, and it was very light, almost inaudible. The volume control didn't seem to do anything. And the music? It's just some weird guitar playing random, non-harmonic notes with a complete disregard for tempo. I'll just post a link here if you want to check it out. That was that. I decided I was done with the cab, and just wanted to find the source of the rotting smell. To be honest, I didn't even care to scrap this thing anymore. It was too weird for me, and I didn't even think anything could be salvaged. I left the car running to see if it might die and unlocked the trunk. Oh, and as if everything wasn't strange enough, the lever to unlock the trunk was behind the driver's side sunshade. So I let the car continue to run, hopped out of the moist and slimy seat, and made my way to the trunk. The stench grew stronger. I was almost certain that there must have been something dead inside the back, but when I opened it I found nothing. In fact, there was no trunk. The trunk access just opened up to a part of the vehicle's casing. The trunk door had absolutely no purpose. But there was something odd about the hinges. They appeared to be, I'm not sure how to explain it, but almost like spider webs. They were certainly not made of no metal, and they didn't look like any sort of regular trunk hinge. That gave me one last idea, and honestly, I didn't know quite what to expect. I could hear the thumping of the car's engine, and I figured the last course of action to take was to visually inspect it. Then, if my suspicions were correct and there truly wasn't anything of value, I'd call a tow truck to have this thing brought to a landfill and buried so it could be long forgotten. I went back to the cab, found the hood release lever, which, mind you, was underneath the driver's seat, and pulled it. The thumping got louder. It was at this point that I truly thought about what I was hearing. The thumping was rhythmic. Thump. Pause. Thump thump. Pause. Thump thump. Pause. Thump. Pause. This didn't sound like no car engine. I closed the driver's door and began making my way towards the front of the vehicle. I placed my hand in the hood, wincing as the roof of the hood felt sticky. I released the hood, flinging it open, and I was met with, well, I don't really know. The first thing I noticed was the heart. Thump thump. Pause. Thump. Pause. I stood awestruck. My mouth was agape. I didn't even notice that this vehicle had no engine, no radiator, no battery. There was a large heart in the center of a clumpy piece of mass. I looked over to where I thought a battery might be, and instead saw what looked like a disfigured brain. The compressor was replaced with lungs, and I watched as they filled and released. Thump thump. Pause. There were no pipes. Everything was connected in disgusting-looking organic tubes. I would say they were arteries, but I'm not entirely sure that the heart was pumping blood. A black ooze was dripping from one of the clumps of tissue, and was spilling over the thick rib cage that kept everything in place. Everything under this car's hood was organic. And I may not know much about human biology, but I can say with confidence that none of the things I saw belonged to a human. I doubt any of it belonged to an animal. I didn't scream. I didn't even make a sound. A million thoughts ran through my head. After a minute of helpless staring, I settled on the easiest course of action. I slammed the hood, turned the vehicle off, and closed up shop for the day. I didn't know what to think. I've never seen anything like it. I didn't bring this up to anyone. I honestly don't know who else to tell. My wife would freak, the local police wouldn't believe me, and what could they do anyways? The next day, the vehicle was missing, but I didn't really give a damn. The night guard told me he didn't see anything about no weird vehicle. Fine by me. I honestly kinda just wanted to forget about it. Perhaps everything I saw was just a bad dream, or a hallucination. Those explanations hardly make any sense, unfortunately. The hole in my fence is real, and the tire tracks for me towing are also real. There was something unnatural in my junkyard that day. The more I think about this encounter, the more uneasy I get. This may be crazy, but I'm actually starting to wonder if the damn thing was actually alive. The details just don't make sense. The radio and its weird imitation of music. The nonsensical engineering of the chassis. The, abundant living tissue. What I came across wasn't no damn car. It was something pretending to be a car. But, why? Story 6. When I was 19, I worked in the grocery department at Whole Foods in Colorado Springs. I started hooking up with a girl who worked as a cashier there. She was a year or two older than me, and had her own apartment in a new development that was built in the foothills, a few miles outside the city. We had finished having sex in the hot tub area of her building one night, and I saw on the clock on the wall above us that it was 2:30 in the morning. I was still living at home at that point, and my stepdad had an annoying habit of waking up to the slightest sound. In high school he had caught me stumbling and drunk more than once. I said goodbye to her and raced home. The road between her new development and the city had mostly fields on both sides at that time, with a middle school at a bend in the road. The speed limit was 40 miles per hour, but there were no other cars, so I was driving 70. As I reached the middle school, a flash of light caught my eye. A cop was sitting in his car in the school parking lot. I tried to slow down, but he had seen me speeding, and I was quickly pulled over. I had never been pulled over before, and turned off my car, but not my headlights. I rolled down my window and watched through my rearview mirror as he walked up to the car. "Hello," he said. "Do you know how fast you were going?" I told him I wasn't sure, but I was sorry if I had been speeding at all. He had clocked me going 60. He asked for my license and registration, and after awkwardly looking for my registration for a long amount of time, I handed them to him and he walked back to his car. I sat in my car and looked out at the city in the distance. He came back and told me that since I had nothing on my record, he was going to write me a ticket for going 10 miles over the speed limit. He pulled out his ticket book and flipped a page. At that moment his walkie-talkie started going crazy. I couldn't understand what was being said, but he grabbed it and listened for a moment, and I could tell from his face it was serious. He put the walkie-talkie back, closed the ticket book, and looked hard at me. "You got lucky. Go home, son. And slow down." He ran back to his car, and a moment later raced by me in the direction of the city. I sat there and watched him go, and gave a big thank you to the universe for my good fortune. I turned the key on my ignition. Nothing. I turned it again. Completely dead. I looked out at my headlights and realized my mistake. I tried a few more times before giving up. There was zero service, so I had no way to call my parents or my insurance company. I decided to walk into the city, where I could see from a distance a Safeway grocery store. I clicked on my hazard lights, and happened to glance in my rear-view mirror. A set of headlights turned on in the darkness, and a minivan materialized out of the night. It pulled up next to me. It was an old maroon minivan with wood paneling on the sides. A middle-aged, balding, rather heavy-set man was driving. He rolled down his passenger window. "Having car trouble?" he asked. I told him what had happened, and he nodded and smiled. His smile was kind and unthreatening, and he offered to jump my car. He asked if I had jumper cables. I didn't think I did, but he told me no problem, and thought he probably had some. He pulled his minivan around so the front of our cars were facing each other. We got out, and after popping the hoods, he scrounged in the back of his minivan and produced a pair of cables. He showed me how to apply them to the battery of my car, and a short while later, my car was running. We chatted for a moment, and I learned his name was Russ. I wanted to ask him what he was doing out in the middle of essentially nowhere at 3 a.m., but thought it would be rude, since he had been only kind to me. We shook hands and got back in our cars. He backed up and pulled up next to me, so our driver's side doors faced each other. "Thanks again," I told him. "I'm so grateful to you." He smiled his kind smile and nodded, then looked forward towards the foothills and the darkness of the mountains beyond. He was quiet for a few moments. "Can I ask you something?" he eventually asked. "Sure." He looked at me. "Are you an angel?" I laughed. "Actually, I was going to ask the same thing to you," I told him. He nodded and looked away again. I needed to know what was forefront on my mind. "Russ, can I ask you something?" "What are you doing out here?" "I just like helping people," he answered. He shook his head. "Huh. I could have sworn you were an angel." He waved and drove off. I watched his taillights turn around the bend and disappear. I was a mix of emotions, but I would sort them out later. The clock on my car read 3:30. I needed to get home. I drove towards the city. As I went down a slope in the road, there were flashing lights coming up on my right. Several cop cars, an ambulance, and a fire truck were semicircled around an accident. As I got close, I saw a familiar old maroon minivan with wood paneling flipped over and crushed. The cop who had pulled me over was standing near the white line of the street and was writing something down. My insides clenched up and went cold. I slowed almost to a stop, and he looked up at me. "Who is that?" I called out to him. My voice sounded to me like I was screaming at the top of my lungs. "Is that Russ?" The cop looked hard at me, then motioned his head towards the city. "Go home, son. And slow down." Story 7. Creeper Car. This particular story took place recently in my little neighborhood. Before we begin, I would like to say that within the past few years, my neighborhood has been relatively quiet and a good place, day or night. But as of now, it has started to run down a tad. Me and my friends, all three of us being 16, decided to walk out to the church that was in the middle of our neighborhood. It is a large yard with a fenced-off playground which was halfway hidden behind the actual walls of the church. You couldn't see half of it from the road, but you could see most of the road from inside of the playground. We were going to meet up with a few of our guy friends, one being 16 and the other being 17. It was within walking distance from my friend's house, who also happened to live in my neighborhood, and so we left and planned to wait in the parking lot. The boys were coming from a while away, and we had gotten their way earlier than we meant to. It was around 12 now, and we were all just talking and joking around. Off in the distance, we all hear what sounds like car engines revving. I didn't think anything of this since we lived in an area where car meets happened often, and a lot of teenagers liked to race and show off their supposed rad cars, which were really just dingy vehicles with a loud exhaust. We decided we wanted to take pictures, for whatever reason, so I took out my phone and began to position my friends to take a picture. We were having a good time. A while passed and the boys were nowhere to be seen. We knew that they decided to walk since they had snuck out, but it was taking way longer than usual since we had met up like this many times before. My friend, Haley, decided to give Jake, the older of the two guys, a call. Her phone rang only once before he answered. He seemed out of breath. "Where are you guys? We've been here forever," Haley said, pretending to be annoyed. There was a small period of silence over the line and glances were exchanged between the three of us. "Yeah, sorry. There's like a huge group of cars speeding around us, so it's just taking longer. We'll hurry up." Jake's voice finally came through, definitely out of breath. I spoke up and asked, "Have you been running? You sounds like you're panting, man." He laughed and said they had been earlier trying to get past the group of cars. We talked for a few minutes over the phone until finally we let them go and hung up. We sat in the grass of the churchyard and just looked around. Harper, the other friend who was there, spoke up. "Does it sound like the cars are getting closer?" "I think they are." I rolled my eyes at this since I knew that Haley was going to start to freak out over this. She had always been the one to overthink things, and especially with it being nighttime, it did not help her brain from running on and on about the terrible things that could happen. I told her I didn't think that they were, and if they were getting closer, it didn't matter, they were just people having a good time. We spent another 5 minutes sitting there, exchanging little to no small talk. We decided to move camp into the fenced playground, which consisted of a gravel section with monkey bars and swings and a singular bench that was placed in the corner, hidden behind the walls of the church. The church had a hollow area cut out of the rectangular building, creating a U shape which had a small garden area. We sat on the bench, taking more pictures. Harper was right, the cars had been getting closer. There was a freeway right next to where the church was and 10 cars sped down, turning into the neighborhood. We sat watching the cars from past us at increasing speeds. Haley began to look more and more nervous, eyes glancing around anxiously. I could care less, and Harper is scrolling on her phone, looking up every now and then. The last car that blew past us was down to the floor and sparked when it bounced on the bumps. They all passed the church and we soon forget about it and focus on the whereabouts of the boys. We go onto Snapchat to look at the location of Jake and see that he has hardly made progress, but that he was on about 3 minutes ago. God, he's slow this time, I say impatiently, trying to get the girls to bring their focus off the stupid cars. I wonder if it's because he's bringing someone else. Do we even know the guy? I ask them and Haley shakes her head and says, "Not a clue. His name's Ethan though." Harper shrugs and looks back at the road, tilting her head. I turn and look over and see a light blue car, low to the ground. It passes us at a normal neighborhood speed, and I recognize it from the group of cars that had turned from the highway. Harper must have noticed that too, since we make eye contact. I shrug my shoulders, again, not thinking anything of it at all. That was until a few minutes passed and it came back from the way it had just gone, this time going much slower. I look at Haley and then back at Harper. I was the most realistic one in these situations and knew that the chances of this being anything more than a car driving was extremely low. But this horrible, nonsensical gut feeling that sent chills down my spine and spread goosebumps all over my arms came over me. I was sent into a quick state of panic as I watched it roll at 10 mph down the road. It was dark in the playground, no light shined down on us, and the only thing that lit us up were the screens of our phones. We could see the street clearly because of the street lights and the lights on the houses, but they couldn't have been able to see us. It finally passed out of view and we all spoke up again and exclaimed our thoughts and worries about the car. Mid-sentence, it drove back the way it went previously and we all jumped up to hide behind the wall of the church. The church had a little side street that you could turn into the parking lot as well as a main entrance. We were able to see some of the side street but not completely all of it. A few minutes passed and we all thought it was gone. We were all high off of adrenaline, Haley within a few seconds of a meltdown. I begin to slowly walk out from around the corner and I see something lighting up the road. I pause, frozen in place. The car had gone into the other entrance of the parking lot and came down onto the side road, which was right next to the gate of the playground. As it cruised into view, going no faster than 5 miles per hour, my phone screen lit up from a call from Jake. I quickly hung up and ducked, running to a bush that was nearby. I cursed under my breath, and as it rolled down to the exit of the side road, its back end hit the ground, causing sparks to shoot up. I feel like all the air has left my lungs, like I can no longer breathe. It finally drove out of view, and that was all it took for all of us to jump up and run to the gate. We opened it and started to run. Haley and I sprint full speed, shooting down through the yard and straight on the main road. I quickly glance over my shoulder to see the car coming back. I run into someone's yard and duck behind the bush. Haley is ahead of me somewhere in someone else's yard, and Harper is sitting behind one of the trees in the church's yard. It begins to slowly drive towards my hiding spot, and I can barely see the headlights through the bush. I can hear the screech of the back of the car dragging on the pavement as it slows to a spot. Fear is rushing through my body, heat overwhelming me as my thoughts race on and on. It stopped right in front of my bush, and I close my eyes, praying for it to go away. It creeps forward finally, and I let out a small sigh of relief. I pop up once again as soon as it's out of sight. Harper is running as fast as she can towards me, and she rasps out, "I saw it coming down the road, and I knew it would have seen me too, but it for sure saw you." She is looking around fearfully, searching for Haley, who seems to be long gone. Harper and I ran as fast as our legs could take us, this being by far the most physical activity I've done in a long time. Finally, we reach Haley's house, where Haley is crouched behind her car that is in the driveway. We all meet up and go to the front door. By this time it is well past 1:30 and we are exhausted. Haley is on the phone with her parents, and we are banging on the door furiously to try to wake up her sister, who is the only one home. She's not answering, and we are increasingly getting more and more tired. Haley is facing the road, breathlessly trying to explain the situation to her parents over the phone while pacing frantically, trying to get the jitters out. Harper and I are still desperately ringing the doorbell and pounding on the door when Haley screams out, "Oh my God, it's right there." The car was passing by the house, headlights shining on us. We knew it was the car since it was low to the ground and light blue. We collectively scream as we see the car sparking down the road, and we run to hide. The adrenaline is so high at this point, and we are all shaking and screaming. Finally, the car passes us, and out of our completely dazed and frantic mindset, we have the bright idea to go through the garage. Haley is blabbering into the phone about how the car now knows where she lives. My brain is starting to clear, and I'm trying to once again see the situation for what it really is. I realize that we are probably scaring the absolute crap out of Haley's parents, so I take the phone from Haley and tell them in the most calm voice I can muster up that we are okay and safe, and that we are inside now, and that they shouldn't worry. We end the call and sit in Haley's living room, sweaty and hot, still panting and thinking about the events that just took place. I then think of Jake and look at my Snap. He was on not too long ago, and I have 2 missed calls and a few messages. I called him back and explained the whole thing. We are all talking over each other, trying to explain it to the best of our ability. We told him to not come out and that we were going to stay in. To this day, this is one of the scariest experiences I've ever been through. If we hadn't acted on our gut feelings, or if they had gotten out of the car when I was in the bush, or even if they had come back to Haley's house, it could have gone horribly. I've never felt this amount of adrenaline in my life, and now whenever we leave the house late at night, we are always so careful.